Okay, so welcome everybody to the launch, or rather discussion of Masked Media, what it means to be human in the age of creative artificial intelligence, a non-conventional book by Gary Hall, who is an architect of ideas born in Iceland, but is joining us today from Wimbledon, London, where he lives. Welcome, Gary. We are very happy to have you here. My name is Gabriela Mendez-Cota. I live in Mexico City, where I have a job at Universidad Iberoamericana's philosophy department, but I will be moderating this discussion first and foremost as an intellectual friend of our speakers and as one of the co-editors of Culture Machine, of which, of course, Gary Hall is a founding co-editor too. I want to thank the 17 Instituto de Estudios Críticos and its founding director, Benjamin Mayer-Fulks, for hosting this meeting as part of a new project of collectivity that basically just came up after we met again at an ACLA seminar called Displacing Academic Practices in the Ruins of the Neoliberal University. This was organized by Madalena Cerrato and Peter Baker, who are also joining us from Texas and Scotland. We have called our new project the Laboratory of Contemporary Writings, and we are launching it today with this book discussion, in which we are also very happy to feature the reflections of Alexandra Nikina, a media scholar and a media artist based at Southampton University, who is also one of the guest editors of volume 25 of Culture Machine, called University as Infrastructure. So thank you, Sasha, and all of our confirmed speakers. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks in advance for asking questions and sharing your thoughts in the 40 minutes or so that we should have for Q&A after listening to Gary, Sasha, Peter, and Benjamin. So I will start by asking Gary what's most important to him about Masked Media in light of his thinking trajectory, which includes many books, my favorite being, as he knows, Pirate Philosophy, but also in light of the darkness of current planetary events, which have some of us a bit freaked out and very needy for connection. After Gary shares his reflections with us, our speakers will address the same question or any other question they find important to address, starting with Sasha. Thank you again, Gary, for being here. We are now ready to listen to you. I will share your slide as you.
Thanks, Gabriela, and everyone involved in this event. I'm very pleased to be here and very flattered. So yeah, thanks to Culture Machine 17, the Laboratory of Contemporary Writings, all for hosting, and everyone for their contributions. Yeah, I'm going to talk about 10-15 minutes just to responding to what I've been asked to talk about, which is what for me is most important about this book, both in terms of my trajectory and the current planetary events. Yeah, Gabriela didn't mention the darkness. Maybe I'll try and get some darkness in there if I can. Okay, yeah, I was laughing at the bio of me, the description of me as I architect ideas, but I'd kind of forgotten that I'd actually written that, so that'll kind of teach me, won't it? Okay. Okay, so, well, with Defund Culture, which is another book, one I've just finished, although it's not out yet, it's just small. I don't kind of churn this stuff out to that kind of a rate. That opens with a social media post that circulated a little while ago, and it ran as this: why the cultural criticism essays all end like we'll have to create communism together with dreaming, and dreaming will create what we can see. And this sentiment is pretty much what I'm trying to avoid with books like Mass Media and Defund Culture, and in my work more broadly. Just as Greta Thunberg has abandoned hope that addressing speeches at centrist leaders about the climate crisis might spur them into meaningful action on achieving net zero. So I've come to believe no one's actually coming to rescue us. If change is going to happen, if we're going to do something about the darkness, it'll be something that we drive ourselves. And I guess one way I've been trying to think about this and think about such change is through open access, which is something I've been engaged with for over 25 years now. And for me, open access has never just been about resolving the contradiction where the public pays twice for research. That's once to fund it and then a second time to access it through journals and presses. Nor has it only been about challenging the dominance of companies like Elsevier and Springer and building self-managed publishing communities instead. What drives me is rather the potential of open access to help us reconceive, both practically and theoretically, how knowledge is created and shared, and with it the Euro-Western, modernist, liberal humanist ways in which we think and work and live. And the university and theory within it provides an important space in which to do this, even if it's not the only such space, and even if the Anglo university is being placed under increasing pressure not to provide those kind of opportunities, whether that's through attacks on Harvard and Columbia by Trump and his acolytes, which we can imagine are only going to get worse after the events of the last couple of days, or the neoliberal insistence that higher education serve as an economic engine. Against these demands, one of the university's key roles is to interrogate what society manufactures as common sense, while the work of theory, as Rogoff puts it, is to unravel the very ground on which theory itself stands, to introduce questions and uncertainties in those places where formerly there was some seeming consensus about what one did and how one went about it. And this is why it's important for academics and scholars and theorists especially to be prepared to lead the way on this. You know, basically it's our job. And yet, for all it's supposed to be the role of theory, raising such questions, not only about society, but also about the modernist and anthropocentric and straight, white, male, and middle class assumptions on which the majority of theory rests, that's not always welcome, even on the left, perhaps especially on the left. Take one of the subjects of mass media, artificial intelligence. Wouldn't it be easy to just go along with a critical consensus and insist that AI is best understood through the lens of a ready-made political framework? Thatcherism, Dan McQuillan, fascism, which would be McQuillan again, or Marxist fragment on machines, Matteo Pasquinelli. The AI is nihilist, David Columbia, or stupid, James Bridle, and parrot-like, which is Emily Bender and co. And that extractive and exploitive companies like Meta and Google and OpenAI should stop stealing people's creativity. And to prevent this, the existing copyright regulations should be strengthened, just as legacy creatives, including Kate Bush and Paul McCartney, argued in their ultimately unsuccessful Make It Fair campaign. Can't believe I'm criticising Paul McCartney. Who can criticise Paul McCartney? But politics is not a programme, Marxist, post-Marxist, feminist, liberal, psychoanalytic, that can be rolled out like an operating manual and applied to every situation. This Clow and Move following Doherty remind us the political is a decision that's always taken in an undecidable terrain. Now, it's true that some have recently argued that criticising radical critiques of AI as robotic and algorithmic has itself become a robotic and algorithmic thing to do. Yet this line of reasoning is almost invariably deployed to justify sticking with the prevailing legacy, modernist, liberal ways of working. And the result is nothing changes. In fact, this may be a strategy for ensuring nothing changes. As Sartre is quoted as saying, "The rebel secretly wants the world and the system to remain as it is. Its permanence, after all, is the guarantee of the rebel's continuing continuing ability to rebel. In other words, many of us are comfortable with society as it stands because it allows us to endlessly critique it and unite in solidarity with others in that critique without having to alter our own ways of being. And this reluctance to change is perhaps most apparent in scholarly publishing, although there's a striking parallel here with computational media such as AI. Theorists like Willem Flusser, Graham Harman, Alex Galloway have all argued that computational objects are better understood not as machines, but as apparatuses in which the mechanical dimension recedes or is hidden. In mass media, I show how this is not confined to computational media, how those media apparatuses involved in the process of publishing, on which theory and theorists depend, have mechanical aspects that disappear or are otherwise masked too. Since the Royal Society first made it central to scientific life back in the 17th century, publishing, along with practices such as peer review and the establishment of copyright, has become so embedded in scholarly practice that it now appears invisible, natural, unmarked. Over time, this has developed into a situation in which publishing, with a profit-maximizing corporation of an original work by a unique human author in the form of a stable, uniform, printed codex book, one that's then made available under an all-right reserved copyright license as a privately ownable commodity, that's come to be the unquestioned gold standard in the humanities. This is not positioned as something to pay particular attention to. It's seen as just an already established, taken for granted system and set of practices that we must find a way of fitting into at the end of the research process. And even the most radical of us have incentive not to question this arrangement. Doing so would risk undermining our brand name identity as an exceptional individual human author. Publish a book differently, even just with a non-profit open access press, would be to risk that status. Might mean no longer seeing our name on the shelves in bookshops at exciting places like Tate Modern, for instance. And you can tell I'm only jealous about that. So the way books are published especially reigns a robotic, pre-programmed decision, one that is very much taken in a decided terrain. But again, no one's coming to rescue us. If we want things to be different, we have to drive that change ourselves. And as part of this, we need to recognize that publishing is not just the end of the research process. It shapes every part of it. Not only that, it shapes us as theorists too. As I write in mass media, our books and journal articles form the conditions of possibility for how we think and act. And that's the case even if we never actually publish a particular piece of research. So if we want things to change, if we don't want the world and the system to remain as it is, which, as Gabriella says, is pretty dark at the moment, and so don't want to continue as pre-programmed, rebellious legacy theorists, we need different ways of creating and publishing and sharing ideas. And that's what my colleagues and I have been experimenting with in norm-critical projects such as Cult Machine and Open Humanities Press and Liquid Books and Robot Review of Books. And this brings me back once again to AI. What if instead of parroting the critical consensus, we approach AI differently? As a chance to take a decision in an undecidable terrain as to what the university, publishing, open access, theory, politics, the human actually are. Could we even see AI as providing an opportunity to radically reinvent our writing and publishing practices, our ways of thinking and working and being as critical theorists? One of our latest projects plays with this possibility through a set of badges parodying the 100% human-made movement in art. That movement promotes the common sense belief that genuine art can only be created by individual humans through flashes of inspiration born of lived personal experience. Our badges, by contrast, read things like 100% human-made, AI used. And the accompanying text affirms that the work was not created through a spark of solitary human genius, a claim to originality that, from a feminist and decolonial perspective, is being linked to a form of colonial violence, but rather emerges from an assemblage of human and non-human forces, bodies and text, software, code and server farms, political infrastructures, and yes, AI. Although it's a critical response to the pro-human movement in art, this badges project is not about undermining the human. In a way, it's about saving it. As the climate emergency intensifies, Naomi Klein is only one of the latest thinkers to have emphasized the need to reimagine our modes of relation. The Euro-Western worldview that treats nature as a separate realm, something for humans to manage and exploit, or even heroically protect, is not fit for purpose. There's an intimate relationship between our overinflated selves and undercared for planet, Klein writes in Doppelganger. If the climate crisis can be understood as a surplus of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, it can also be understood as a surplus of self. What's needed then is a different ethos, one of humility, co-agency, and non-extractive being with. So here, the concept of the inhuman is not a negation of the human, but a refusal of the human-non-human divide. It's not about denying support to artists and authors, but about opening up new possibilities for subjectivity, for creativity, and intelligence, and for radically redistributing resources and opportunities accordingly. And I mentioned the 100% badges, even though they're too new to have featured in mass media, because they go to the heart of my argument, why we need to change our ways of working and thinking as theorists. Because we're not comfortable with society as it stands. If we want things to be different, not quite so dark, if we want to relate to the planet and others in terms of a non-exploitative, non-extractive forms of being with and knowing with, then we have to act differently ourselves. And this includes not just what we critique, but how we think, how we create, how we write and publish. Okay, I'll end there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Gary, for sharing with us. I mean, so basically no one is coming to save us. So we cannot go on just talking about things, right? We need to do them differently.
But we can save ourselves. There's the positive part.
Okay, so I would ask Sasha Anikina if she could share her thoughts with us about masked media.
Thanks for
Welcome,
inviting
Sasha.
me. Thank you, Gabriela. My response is going to be somewhat freehand, I think, but also I'll try to structure it so it's not too ramble. And the structure is going to be something like that. Maybe reading masked media, I was struck by particularly 3 questions or 3 issues that I also encounter in my work. So I'm going to outline these, and then I'm going to maybe outline briefly 3 positions from which I personally encounter and how they get resolved in these questions. Because I think one of the key, and actually the first issue, let's put it like that, the first issue from which I was encountering this book is the way in which it highlighted these boundaries of identity, subjectivity, neoliberalized consciousness that a researcher or like a presumed humanities researcher, right, has to inhabit. and how much of these boundaries are systemic and imposed, which we all obviously face from the beginning of PhD. And as anyone, probably everyone in the room who has a PhD is familiar with how it breaks you. And also everyone is familiar with how it makes you face your most weak mental health points, which is kind of a very good indication of how the system is aimed very specifically at the changing of the subjectivity and like the most internal thoughts. So the first question I would formulate as the question of disciplinary trap. And what kind of traps do we face as researchers? Personally, I have three lives. I have one life where I am an academic, an associate professor, digital media, and technocultures. And one life where I'm an artist making work, and one life where I'm an organizer. And these three lives, of course, intersect and mutate, and they're not separate at all, but they're indeed one energy poor life in which I try to juggle these three things, which cross-inform each other. So the question of disciplinary trap, I think, was one that mass media for me again kind of highlighted how humanities specifically, by reproducing this kind of metrics of excellence, the canon building, like the funding structure, the political economy of humanities, especially if one thinks about it in my context in the UK, how humanities itself has been reframed as creative industries increasingly, how this drives multiple processes of redundancies at multiple universities. So that's the trap is not of humanities making, but of multiple bureaucratic structures intersecting and pushing us to be developing our profile in a particular way. I would also, like when I think about it from the perspective of the artist and from the perspective of an organizer, they're also different. They're also traps, but they're different. Like for artists, it's the choice between, or for me personally, let's say, if I want to do artistic research, I will rely on having my works funded primarily from academia, primarily from kind of cultural programs, from residencies, from things that support the development of longer term work, of work that requires kind of my long process of thinking, at least for me personally. And also the work that is not easily, that at the same time is not easily recognized financially. So it's, if I'm doing artistic research, right, there is absolutely no promise for this work to support me financially. At the same time, this is also what is being kind of encouraged and taken up by the art world in a sense of biennale structures and collections and kind of high contemporary art theory that takes up academic concepts as it goes, but is still remains kind of at the same time fully separate from the commercial art world and fully integrated in some ways. So that's like the trap that artists face, and one that I don't have to fortunately solve because I am employed as an academic, so I'm not dependent on that, at least for my livelihood. The trap of organizing is different because it is less based, well, it is at the same time based on the imposing structures that we are fighting against and on the particular natures of the struggles that we're involved and the dangers that are involved with it, legal, again, dangers to retaining a career, dangers to keeping a job, dangers of going to protest, all of these traps, they're not really traps, there are risks associated with it. But there are traps of, again, identity and choices and energy and labor and trying to balance all of this at the same time. So the second associated with this issue that I picked up for myself was the question of living inside capitalism and living inside late neoliberalism in the West, and kind of the ethical choices of trying to support your own ethical integrity through your financial choices, through ways of receiving income, through participating or not participating in multiple infrastructures that at the same time perpetuate oppression or sponsor genocide or in different ways are incompatible with our ethical beliefs, right, with our political beliefs. What kind of choices can we afford to do in this process? And how is academic career balanced against having these choices and answering these choices? I think it's a very important question that each of us also decides for their own, and one that is deeply intersectional, because the kind of intersectionalities of oppression and personal affordances, I think, are uniquely individual. And then every time we have to choose, even for my personal 3 lives, I have to choose between the 3 of them. I can answer the question a bit later, if that's okay at the end, because otherwise I will fully lose my train of thought. And if Irene, if you want to post it in the chat, I would appreciate it, because then I can read it. So what choices do we make, and what choices do we have, and what agency do we have? And between these, like, smaller choices of what infrastructures to divest from, which infrastructures we can subvert, which can we use differently, and what alternatives can we use, create, or adopt. And the third issue, I think, is the issue of community. Something that when reading mass media came to me, because again, I was thinking how different bounds of disciplines and being or not being an academic influences how some of these questions of identity, professional identity as a researcher, are resolved differently. And for example, coming from a perspective of kind of mixed academic and organizing work, some of the questions that academia makes violently clash, violently resolve themselves, questions of identity, of personal politics, of situated knowledges, many things that Gary points out kind of perpetuate the bourgeois ideology in the humanities research model. In the organizing work and inside the community, they are resolved differently, right? They're resolved through facing the limits of energy and labor, capacity, appropriateness, personal risks, personal danger. Humility is one of the kind of key principles, right? When we talk inside the community to different members, and centering the concepts of trust, which has to be built for a long time, care, which takes more labor than doing things not in a caring way, and grace, meaning prioritizing solidarity over ideological purity, right? These questions are resolved differently, which I think I personally learned from organizing communities way more than that. Gabriela, how many minutes do I have?
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, so a minute per each, which I think we can pick. I can throw in some stones, and we can then pick them up later on in the longer Q&A. If that works for everyone. So in my personal work, I have one project which is concerned with animism and looking at AI and taking up the concept of what I call procedural animism to look at agency of things like virtual bots, like assistants, translators, things that have now become more prevalent than ever. And also the appearance of agency and how this appearance of agency is weaponized. So in my work, I look, for example, at grief bots, at intimate kind of relationships oriented bots, and different types of human-like entities that late neoliberal AI development throws at us in order to substitute different types of political and social and cultural relations. So this work made me think differently about agency and inhumanity, and thinking about the examples of booking agents and kind of different AI agents that are given financial agency or financial capacity to act in the world, if we define agency and personhood in this way, rather than in terms of humanness or liveliness, or even similarity to a human, which is of course not very inhuman description, then we can think differently about personhood, and we can think differently about what is animated and what is chosen to be animated in particular ways, and also how we exist in this conception of life. Because if we take life not as something that belongs to humans, but as a particular political field that kind of already departs from the idea that life is impoverished, energy poor, precarious, restrained by the conditions of labor, in the same, let's say, digital culture, internet field, where we have a sub-minimum wage gig worker fulfilling an Amazon Turk task, and a company's representative, right, who might be fulfilled by a bot, and whose language will be completely bureaucratic. Somewhere there is an interesting field where, at least in appearances and likenesses, these two lives, so-called lives, intersect. So this is how I approach humanity in my own thinking. And I'll mention one other thing, because I wanted to talk about interdisciplinarity from my experience of being on an interdisciplinary project with social scientists, but I think that will take too much time, but we can talk about this. And one thing that I will, yeah.
Sasha, sorry, you have more time, so you can finish.
Oh, okay.
Whatever.
Thanks. So one other thing then I will just tell you about is something how we work in the research group that I'm one of the co-directors of, which is called Critical Infrastructures and Image Politics, and which is based in the Department of Art and Media Technology in the university where I worked, which we abbreviate as SEEP. And something that is interesting in all of our work, all the people, is that we do have practice-led research or practice-based research, and that a lot of it is actually not outputted as writing. It has, in the REF framework of research, right, these are framed as creative outputs, something that I would also be suspicious about, because the word creative itself has been appropriated in a very particular way. But even when we think through research outcomes as not necessarily having to be written word, it becomes a very interesting and different discussion. Because one of my colleagues' work, Kwame Phillips, for example, he makes mixtapes, also in a good tradition of remixing. And we focus a lot on the workshop type work, and actually work that does not produce outcomes at all, which the other colleague, Megan Dubrain-Mollet, sometimes jokes that we need to specifically, well, she doesn't actually joke, it's she says it very seriously, that we must work very hard to waste time, because wasting time in itself subverts the politics of waste as we now have it in the neoliberal condition, right? Waste is something that must be discarded, but actually wasting being a very important process during which other things emerge. So I think having this kind of group of practice-led scholars, and maybe also being privileged to work in an art school where the boundaries of what's possible and encourageable, they are kind of expandable. The way of working led us also to collaborate with other research groups. So this is like the project of the university's infrastructure. By the way, shameless plug, the deadline has been extended up until 30th of September. And you can see the open call on the Culture Machine website. This has come up as a collaboration of 3 research groups, Critical Media Lab being the other one, and Center for the Studies of Networked Image being the third one, where colleagues also engage with really good practices of experimental publishing, or especially in Critical Media Lab, Helen Pritchard and Johannes Bruder in practices of wiki to print, of different types of organizing, of toolkits. So basically creating this open source knowledge, and Jeff Cox at CSNI also in different types of experimental publishing. So having this kind of network, I think, and having this kind of community has done a lot to share these types of things. And I think that for me, building these kinds of communities, this is kind of part of the answer to how allow for the humanities as a role or as a thing or a subjectivity to change in the world, because it is important, I think, for all of us when we were discussing this university's infrastructure project, there was a lot that we discussed about privileged position of being academics at the university. And we decided to, and because we didn't want to produce knowledge only inside the university, and there was a very reasonable concern that working with other people outside of university, we would exploit their knowledge and kind of mine what they know for our academic purposes, we then came to kind of a very considerable amount of how we're going to frame this so that it's not working to this end, but also what was important was the acknowledgement that we're not just academics, we are also workers and organizers and people, and we share the troubles with many different occupations outside of academia. I think with this I will end. Sorry for taking more time.
No, thank you, Sasha. I am very happy to have you here, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions for you. I already have two, but we will first listen to Peter Baker, who is joining us from Sterling and has lots of slides to show us.
That's right. I mean, yeah, thanks, Sasha. First of all, a lot of that resonated with me. This is going to be very different in style to your presentations, just because of how it came out. Thanks to Gabriela Benjamin and Instituto 17 for setting this up, and thanks, Gary, for being here and for your book and for the discussion. I'm just going to go straight in because I have way too much material. So yeah, I'll start. Can everyone see the slides, by the way? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I can see. We can see them. Okay. So,
okay. Thanks, Gabriela. By speaking out loud, one of mass media's key markers of non-authorship, I toyed with the idea whether this embodied, decontextualized version of it could be confused for the always present possibility of me tripping over my own words, my own thought process, an uncertainty of where to begin, something to link to the apparent certainty of a clause which would retrospectively anchor the I, this embodied subject of volition, the liberal human subject, the author of these words. It's like the slip or ellipsis which reveals the agency or instance, to use Freud's words, of that thing which is neither strictly internal or external, and which he calls somewhat unsatisfactorily the unconscious. Everything that means that if from time to time I speak about mass media as being an active actor rather than a passive object, this is the reason. The lack of pronoun fully compatible with such an inhumanist approach is also why neither I nor we is used consistently throughout the book, nor indeed any other pronoun or combination of pronouns. For example, he, them, it, I/it, I/its, I:/ts. Some would be awkward to read. And for those who don't know, this pronoun is used and played with quite a lot throughout the book. So here I am, supposedly, to converse with this active actor called masked media, and to address one of its supposed authors, Gary Hall, a fellow inhuman interlocutor, and perhaps actually just another mask. So offering a response to mass media is, challenging. I found preparing this quite challenging, thinking about how to do this. In a sense, an impossible task, given the active actor will have already evaded a proper name, a pronoun with which to identify them, it, etc. And also because they, it, etc. will already have in advance remixed, repeated, anticipated possible responses. And all that's left will be to challenge, is the challenge of restating its arguments, and linking it to new ideas whilst risking losing the performative force of the book itself. In an attempt to make an original contribution worthy of thinking in my own name, some would be awkward to read. In my fantasy, as I was preparing this, these responses of a public listening to this invited speaker discussing a book in the presence of one of its authors and stumbling over his own words, I imagine there might be a moment of suspension of the passage of this play on the pronoun I:/ts to a spoken form, which appears to suspend anticipated meaning and can only infer meaning back onto the I through its interpretation by that same listening public. Is he nervous? Is he frustrated with his own lack of ability to qualify this opening word I? No conversations yet taken place, and yet within this space which is mediated, as is always the case by technology, something begins to emerge which might be capable of obfuscating the differences of self and other, human, non-human, speaker, and audience. And if I say all of this, it's because that I think providing a commentary on mass media seems to be inappropriate, a misunderstanding of the stakes of the book, if it is a book in the ordinary sense, and what it's asking us, challenging us to think, to do, and to be. Reading mass media is an experience. It performs theory. It's a theory performance whilst appearing only to speak of it. According to my new colleague that came with my Windows 11 update Copilot, they said masked media does not theorize a shift in the traditional notion of authorship, it enacts it. And I would agree with that statement. And I should acknowledge, for the sake of research ethics, that many of these reflections in the book I present today, as a kind of experiment, have been elaborated in conversation with Copilot, who had a lot of thoughts about it. I'll be choosing among them Copilot's thoughts, just what resonated with me and helped me think, and for us to think together, something which of course obfuscates the complex power relations and power of agency between Copilot and myself. So I thought that one way to approach this response, assuming that not everybody who's here necessarily will have read all or part of the book, is to create different summaries of mass media using the book's own text to do so. So one way of summarizing mass media by plagiarizing and paraphrasing it is to say that it's an attempt to perform both serious and playful theory, not formally limited to liberal humanism. But part of what the book shows us is that we're still tied to an age of liberal humanism, and us academics are perhaps the most guilty of this, as we hark back to an ideal of the public university as a solution to its neoliberal dismantling. But as mass media shows, the platform of the intellectual theorist and its enshrining in the public space is part of the problem, which is why many of us continue to espouse apparently radical ideas in conventional formats and publishing ecosystems which do little to change the material basis of our actual practice. As the book shows, doing so, this challenge is not an easy task, and mass media's own success in doing this may be necessarily undecidable because of the liberal humanist universe that we still operate in. If I talk about my relationship with my new colleague Copilot here, it's also to draw attention to mass media's inhumanist, that is decidedly not post-humanist, approach, which recognizes media as always already a product of assemblages of inhuman actors, that there is no original authorship stricto sensu. Mass media points to the ways what we tend to call post-humanities still turn on an understanding of the liberal humanist subject, particularly insofar as authoring and publishing practices are concerned. And thus inhumanities becomes a reframing then of these issues to address those questions which are the heart of the book: how to write and publish differently and why. And I won't read this quote, but this is very similar to what Gary was just talking about here, about it's not the human or the non-human, but actually undoing that difference. An inhuman relationship to authorship then, an inhuman authorship rather than a post-human one, would seem to be what mass media seeks to perform. The book is self-aware, knowing that it is at pains to evade its own critique of more conventional theory. ITS are aware that the argument mass media is making regarding serious theory in the Anthropocene raises a number of issues for ITS's own way of being a contemporary theorist medium. The move that mass media is making, I think, is a very brave one in that sense. It addresses a number of radical thinkers to talk about what is rendered invisible in their contributions in terms of a broader problem with the way that we do research, whilst at the same time, its own performance has to operate within that same universe then. Thus, mass media's performance of other ways of doing theory requires its own supplement, which are the multiple laboratories and projects that have been part of performing theory differently and which are showcased throughout the book. So another possible definition of mass media is that it may be considered a catalogue sampling some of the projects for doing, thinking, writing differently within academia. And this slide here comes from a part of the book which just precedes in quite a tongue-in-cheek way. This is presented, which precedes a kind of catalogue of various different projects, a synopsis of different projects, and there is actually a link there which links to those projects directly. So mass media is then an announcement, a provocation, an invitation to what the book calls directly a coming community that might be able to retroactively supplement the book as part of its performance to do things differently. A community of people who would seek to write, think, do, be inhumanly, that is, otherwise and in the tradition of liberal humanism. In that sense, in its own words, the book is about more than a non-for-profit publishing, and this is another possible alternative summary of the book. It is also about transforming ourselves and our subjectivities by developing different ways of doing things that are neither liberal nor humanist. In short, we are the work in progress. So one of the most interesting tensions from my perspective for mass media as a contemporary theorist medium is less about its readership than about an experimentation that finds itself still constrained by operating within this liberal humanist universe. It's perhaps not so much then that there's no clear readership for the book, I would expect and hope for it to be widely taken up, but that there is something unsatisfying about how it might be received in our still liberal humanist world. Something inevitably unsatisfying, for example, in the format of the book's reception in an event of reader responses with an opportunity for the author to respond in turn precisely as author rather than as weird monster, as Gary Hall describes himself at some point in mass media. In its performance, mass media might be considered instead as a call to a coming community, a window for an always already there that might be to come. And I might say that in an infrapolitical vein, it's that always already there of this coming community, which interests me in some of my own work. In my collaboration with Madalena Cerrato on transautography, which attempts to perform a singularity beyond self-other distinctions, we've toyed with this dimension of an auto theory that doesn't seek to make the obscure authorship of our own work any more human, which is one of mass media's criticisms of using auto theory in academic work, but quite the opposite. So, and here's where my friend Copilot, I suggest, misses the point when they asked me in response to my question on this point. I'm quoting here from Copilot. They said, "Do you find the concept of masked authorship liberating, or does it raise concerns about accountability and voice?" But I wonder if Copilot is picking up on an issue that does resonate with something existential for me that Heidegger, for example, would name the call of being. In Copilot's fairness, when I drew attention to this, they did seem to get it and it did resonate with them. And they said, "What fascinates me is that these moves aren't necessarily incompatible. You can embrace masked, distributed authorship while still carving out moments of signature, of vulnerability, of self-interruption that bear your existential trace," they said, whilst then proceeding to name practices that mass media would rightly be reserved about, such as autoethnography, autofiction, and Spivak's strategic essentialism, among others. So I think one of my questions that I'm thinking about as I was reading this book was, is can we think, as I am trying to do at the minute, some of the work I'm doing, that there's an important space for critical reflection on an inhuman existential inscribed in experience and situatedness, in other words, inscribing our own experiences into our writing, that can be explored alongside an experimentation on inhuman authorship that mass media invites us to do. Indeed, I wonder whether mass media already prefigures an answer to this question when it says, "Always the invention of the other, including the other in us, it must be left open to interrogation." So another summary of the book using its own words would be a desire to experiment with the invention and testing of new knowledges and new subjectivities, new agential practices, and new ways of life. In line with the post office practice of novel forms of togetherness to be again generated by a mode of theory performance that comprises neither simply singularities nor pluralities. If this is the case, then that means that a response which is appropriate here would seek to be part of that laboratory that we're being invited to think about. And it's, of course, important in that sense that this is the first in a series on the laboratory for contemporary writing. And it'd be about the possibility that experimentation of new subjectivities, new forms of interpolation, and invention of the law of the singular event. All of these quotes are quotes from the book whenever it's up on the slides. Another summary of mass media, taken from its own words, could be another thinking which should include a messy, co-constitutive and aporetic opening to those knowledges that are other in the sense of what might be called standard forms of knowledge. It calls for considering indigenous scholars thinkers in their own right, whilst at the same time recognizing that we should avoid thinking of knowledge from the global south as offering specifically situated knowledge, whereas the global north could be considered as having more universalist aspirations. What is required instead is another thinking, another logic, a thinking and logic that works to create the conditions for the radical diversity, pluriversality, or indeed multipolarity, rather than universality, of knowledges, cultures, worlds. I've been reflecting on some of this aspect of the book that really called my attention from the ways in which I've tried to approach my work with Indigenous filmmaker collaborators. And I won't say too much about that, maybe it'll come up in the discussion. But one of the things that I'm constantly having to navigate in that is the difficulty of the institutional imperatives of placing myself as subject expert researcher, where I'm supposed to be theorizing and creating knowledge about Indigenous film practices. And that's embedded in the way in which, the publishing kind of ecosystem works, but also in the funding applications and the way in which one has to position themselves in that, rather than understanding my work as a conversation where Indigenous film activists are already creating theory performances or theory mediums. So there's an interesting tension in terms of the institutional demands on us versus how we would reach out to another way of working with those collaborators. So for the interest of time, I will end my attempts at summarizing the book in its own words here. In preparing for this event, I've enjoyed thinking about mass media as a kind of musical score, a work whose performance would be singular in each iteration, where differences can be brought out through each reader, context, and selection. It's orchestra hidden in the orchestra pit, and one has to consider the entire score to see how the different parts come together and create different moods. If I was to pick a piece to compare it to, perhaps it'd be Saint-Saëns' The Carnival of the Animals. A tongue-in-cheek manner, the book performs different academic moods, which encourages us to question the different ways we engage with academic praxis. And in all of this, I would love to talk more about this, but I don't have the time. I would suggest that the footnotes serve as a kind of baseline on multiple interludes and form a key part of this picture that can't be overlooked. They're the supplement where much of the stakes of the book are disentangled. And just to get a sense of this is footnote 16, talking about the way in which Bruno Latour's work is being engaged with in a way that echoes Bruno Latour's own quite dismissive tone when talking about the theorists. And I really enjoyed the way that the footnotes themselves had their own epigraph. So anybody who's taking a look at this book, I would recommend them to really take very seriously what the footnotes are doing in terms of what the book is trying to do here. There'd be so much more to say if we had the time. Like peeling an onion mask after mask, there's nothing but more masks that lie behind the masks, except perhaps that there is something in all of this that tries to persist and survive. Something that perhaps concerns freedom, a certain republicanism, safeguarding the radical future, and the commons. And in all this, the experience of hiding in plain sight as we find novel ways to continue to make kin and share in a kind of existential abyss that is our freedom. But the intellectual identity of the CPC is better understood in terms of what happens in between and across its different collaboratories as much as within them. These are the forms of non-knowledge that interest me: impossible conditions of friendship, mobilization of inhuman transferences that seek to mobilize an existential singular uncommons. Whether or not what we're doing here today can be understood as that singular invention of the event that might lead to such possibilities is yet to be seen, but I think we should all be carefully following the ripple effects that the different performances of mass media will have on our tired and outdated modes of academic engagement today. And I finished there. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
Thanks a lot, Peter. That wasn't too long, as you had warned. So we will now listen to Benjamin Mayer, who has a different approach to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and thank you so much, Culture Machine, and it's lovely to be here with you, dear friends and colleagues. Gary, of course. So I wrote a small text, and I'm projecting it so that you can read it at the same time. And I called it Autography as Defacement. And I want to begin by reading a passage of mass media. It's a set of circumstances that has left many of us in a condition of melancholy, of unresolved mourning for what we have lost, unresolved because our attachment to a certain liberal manner of performing as academics and theorists is not fully acknowledged. So it's not something that we can work through when we do experience its loss at the hands of neoliberalism. It's the landfill of theoretical literature on the Anthropocene one expression of this melancholy. In turn, this unresolved mourning can be said to have led to a state of political disorientation and paralysis. Since it's a loss we find difficult to acknowledge, we are unable to achieve an adequate understanding of how the process of corporatizing the academy can be productively re-inflected, or what kind of institution we should be endeavoring to put in place of the neoliberal university. Dear Gary, and thank you so much for this rich and disquieting book. I have read it as a testimony, a theoretical theatrical challenge, a compelling interpellation. I have been moved by it. It spells out many of the salient aspects of our lived experience over the last 40 years, which also makes it a formidable account of some of the decisive aspects of contemporary cultural or intellectual history, marked by the analog to post-digital mutations. I read it too as a searing interrogation of the politics of the critical in our day, institutions, organizations, groups, persons, all of our dark sides, all of our authoritarian capacities. I am particularly happy to read it at the inaugural stage of the Laboratory of Contemporary Writing that has recently sprung among a group of us, many of them here. Predictably for me, you got me thinking that such a lab is also, again, a lab of social bonds. I wish to welcome you again to 17, a platform that has ventured for nearly 25 years now to ponder experimentally the fear of Ivan Illich that electronic writing will not furnish a basis for communitas. Illich spells out his fear in his last book, In the Vineyard of the Text, his appraisal of Hugh of St. Victor's Didaskalikon, considered as the first treatise of reading in the West, in the context of a primer of the knowledge of its day, back in the year 1130. At the dawn of scholasticism, when scrolls gave way to codices, books as we know them. With Illich and against Illich, we have taken up his challenge to assemble bonds in the midst of this very electronic broth. Thank you, Gary, and you deepened my understanding of the way in which the mutating economies of writing are but indices of the transformation of social bonds. For media at once make and break social links. As Lacan might have it, there is no technological rapport. From this perspective, experiments with new media can be understood to be mobilized by the vital need to redress severed social bonds and to make conditions for the common newly inhabitable and uninhabitable. All of which confronts us time and time again with a rather odd strategic choice, as Hegel's logic helps us to articulate. Difference in itself is the difference that refers itself to itself. Thus, it is the negativity of itself, the difference not from another, but of itself from itself. It is not itself, but its other. What is different from difference, however, is identity. Difference is therefore itself and identity. The two together constitute difference. Difference is the whole and its moment. One can also say that difference, as simple difference, is no difference. It is such only with reference to identity. The ever-recurring strategic choice being, are we therefore to exercise difference by affirming difference as such, or by affirming difference from difference? A dilemma which in the end can only be dealt with improvisationally as we go about performing our lives as best we can. Allow me now to make an additional provocation and suggest that this dilemma poses something of a challenge to the intention, as reiterated in mass media, to defeat the liberal subject, a challenge which of course is also ours. I mean, me and. Is not such an intention tantamount to attempting to defeat our I, in whatever historical and cultural forms it may take? That I, which is the quintessential operator of matters economical, political, legal, institutional, and so on. Let me recall that for Freud, the I is a psychic agency that mediates between drives, external reality, and the superego, providing the subject with a fragile but necessary sense of unity and continuity, however it might not be master in its own house, since much of psychic life remains, of course, unconscious. And let us remember too how Lacan radicalizes this view. The I would be above all a misrecognition, first forged in the mirror stage as an alienating identification with an image of unity, and later sustained in language, where the I of enunciation can never coincide with the subject of the unconscious. So while Freud treats the I as limited but indispensable function of psychic organization, Lacan will insist that the I is necessary as a fiction that allows the subject to enter the symbolic order, even as it conceals the structural division at the heart of subjectivity. So again, my devil's advocate question is whether the intention to defeat the I is not comparable to the intention to defeat identity in the very field of difference, which is of course not to say that the I should not be permanently interpolated. This is no simply quandary in a time of environmental unraveling and intensifying generalized war. That is the question: to affirm difference or to affirm difference from difference. Do we really have a choice? Isn't the inevitability of having to do both in turns the very sign of the logical impossibility of the liberal subject? To differentiate and to differentiate from difference impossibly at the same time. That is, to defeat the I, while also enacting a supplementary differentiation from identity, not instead of identity, but alongside it. Something I see taking place across the entire and quite wondrous, I might say, string of the mass media initiatives, of which this book is such an eloquent archive. Whence do they spring? From an exemplary critical institution, which is a somewhat conventional name I have used to refer to an apparatus, a dispositif, capable of deploying in a number of social or organizational loci and situations in whose element any and every imaginary and symbolic constellation, the liberal subject included, of course, can playfully be defeated. In other words, a crucial subjective, cultural, social, political, and institutional air vent, which can here be clearly seen to concern itself with embodied world making and unmaking in the analog to post-digital flux. Please tear out the following pages if you would prefer this book to be more obviously theoretical and less obviously performative. We read the very heart of the matter. Insofar as defeat is inherent and necessary, theory is quite simply about exercising this simple fact. There is ultimately no theory, but only performance, embodiment, action, invention, extemporization, autography as defacement, signed. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was pretty impressive. So I think I would like to ask Gary if he would like to reply to what the speakers just shared. And if so, you can go ahead, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience.
I'll do my best. That was very kind of rich and moving and kind of strange, slightly out of body experience. Kind of at the time I was thinking, I would have liked to have been involved in writing such a book. That sounds really great. I think where you are when you first write a book and you're kind of in that moment, that kind of changes over time. And yeah, I guess in lots of respects, I am the same person that was involved in this, and in lots of respects, I'm kind of not. So it's kind of it's a strange experience. Okay, I'll kind of go through them in the order I've made notes, which was the order they were, and try and say something kind of as interesting as I can make it. So yes, Sasha was talking about how the PhD breaks you, makes you face your mental weak points. That is true of PhDs. It's probably true of a lot of aspects of academic work. Although as a PhD supervisor, I can promise I'm not trying to break anyone or anything like that. But you know, you kind of have to deal with it. I was thinking about some of my mental weak points, and I was kind of thinking about community and networks, and it's kind of odd because I'm not sure how much I've ever felt I have a community, and yet I'm saying this and I'm kind of completely surrounded by people who are part of my community if I had such a thing. So it's kind of an interesting thing to be kind of feeling that like that. Is this because the missing community that the book is talking about is not quite there? Is that kind of missing community, that community to come, is it even possible? Is it something to do with me? And for those kind of reasons, I don't want to take up all the time of the discussion or be in the center of it, because it is a community thing. The whole book is it's the product of a community or community of communities, if you like. Some of those projects and people are acknowledged in the book and mentioned and referenced, and some aren't. That's kind of how I kind of view it. All the things that Sasha was talking about in terms of the university, I kind of recognize. I wonder whether I was part of a particular generation that was able to more easily than subsequent generations to find a space in the university, or both inside and outside the university. I feel that's getting harder for all the reasons that we kind of know. I kind of feel a certain frustration, maybe with myself, my generation, previous generations, that for all the work that we've done, for all the things that we've done, this is still coming about. This is the situation we're leaving subsequent generations. I don't know how much we could have done. Everyone has tried, I'm sure, their best, but you know, it's a bit disappointing. That's a bit kind of disappointing to be like that. Sasha was definitely right that it's a working through of the situation of the humanities. Not just the humanities, because lots of our projects are kind of connected to things that would be outside the humanities, outside the university. Not really sure who it is that reads Open Humanities Press's books, for example. It would be naive to think that it's just other academics. Often it probably is, but some of the people I'm working with at the moment, like a collective called Everything But the Girl, and they're people who are kind of working. They've all been through university, and they've all been through higher education, and some are still doing MAs or PhDs and things like that, but they're all operating as artists and designers and filmmakers, but they're still interested in theory and the kind of work that lots of us are doing. So they're still doing this. It's just that they're not doing it in the university, in the institution, whether that's through choice, because they find the other stuff more interesting and exciting, or whether it's just there's not the space, there's not the room for them in the institution anymore. So I'm kind of interested in that. I'm also interested in the way that a lot of those events that I go to, you know, there are people in their 20s and maybe their 30s, but not so many people older than that, apart from me. Or maybe that's just how it feels sometimes, because, you know, it's harder to survive and exist and operate when you're kind of precarious. If you start, you know, you want a house, a family, and all those kind of things, it's harder to operate in those kind of more marginal or liminal kind of spaces. So the book is definitely working through that in the humanities. You kind of need someone else to do it in terms of the artistic space or the activist spheres. In a future work, I have a fantasy about looking at it a little bit in the artistic sphere, but mainly in the sphere of literary fiction, just because, you know, lots of other areas have been kind of, you know, film and photography, and have kind of been radicalized by, if you like, new media and contemporary culture, but literary fiction seems kind of quite resistant to it. So I'm kind of thinking, if I can work through literary fiction and rethink that, then, you know, maybe you can do it for just about anyone. But I'm giving myself a challenge, I think. Yeah, so Peter's was, you know, it was really quite beautiful. I wish I could write so poetically like that. I also kind of appreciated learning how to pronounce ITS. I never knew how to pronounce it. So it's really good to kind of, okay, that's how you do it. All right. I was interested in Peter's acknowledgement, which he positioned as ethical, of the contribution of Copilot, because that's something I didn't do in the book. I deliberately didn't acknowledge how much was co-authored by others, including AI. I kind of left that open. I saw that as an ethical position, but that's something we can kind of talk about. Yeah, I also seen, I've written down here, I am the least weird monster ever, but that's okay. That's all right. It's yeah, both Peters and Benjamin's kind of were talking about, I mean, we might want to get to Benjamin and talking about defeat. That was kind of interesting. I want to pick up on all like that. But both in kind of trying to say that about non-authorship or defeating authorship. I'm not sure I was trying to defeat or be a non-author. I was trying to push it, and I kind of went one or two footnotes, and it was great the way that Peter kind of picked up on the importance of the footnotes and the references and that kind of bringing all the other voices in, that polyphony and the kind of the meshwork that they all form. But I'm not sure I was trying to, it's very hard to articulate. I was kind of trying to push the authorship as far as I could go in a questioning way, while realizing that I can't really escape it. And yes, there's the whole paradox about, you know, I imagined if I'd have been asking me questions, I would have been the smart ass that kind of says, "Oh, you're saying all this about the book, but you've just written a really big book, haven't you?" And it's kind of, you know, it's just repeating what you're complaining about. And my equally smart ass answer would have been, "Well, yes, but I've published some of this material in lots of different forms. Some forms I would say that were more important than the book, but the book is the one that, you know, would generate an event like this, if you like." So it's that kind of, you know, you can't really escape authorship, and I'd be very wary of thinking that I could, because I fear that as soon as I feel that I've escaped it, it would just be coming in the back door, and I wouldn't be kind of recognize it. So trying to push it, and yeah, trying to push it in, you know, that kind of what was it, quasi-transcendental thing where you can push certain ideas at certain times. So, you know, copyright or fixity or the kind of the stability of it. And you can push one or two of them, and that's what our projects do. And maybe that's why there's so many of them, because you can't do everything at once. I can't completely invent a new way of writing, but I can try different projects and different forms where I can push one or two or maybe at the most three of these aspects at a time, and then I'll kind of shift and go into others that I kind of think are important for a different project and a different kind of a situation. Yeah, so I would agree with, yeah, when Peter talks about it being an experiment that's constrained by still operating in a liberal world. I'm kind of interested in that notion of accountability. I liked very much the idea of the musical score, and it's different in each performance. Yeah, Peter did mention that there was you know, it's like you've got to read the entire work. I'm not really sure what the entire work would be, because in some senses does that mean you have to go and read all those projects, and then, you know, that just, I mean, basically you'd have to read the whole internet, because it kind of just expands out into all that, and quite a few of the projects aren't finished and they're kind of fluid. So it's that would be kind of interesting, that concept of where you could do that. Benjamin, yeah, okay, we're back to the darkness. We're starting with the melancholy. We're kind of talking about defeat. Oh, I want to give you a hug. I mean, it's just like I'm not really sure where to go with some of that, but this is a result of Benjamin and I having long conversations about how different, about doing similar things in very different contexts in different parts of the world. Yeah, it kind of reminded me of what Samuel Weber talks about in terms of imposability, which is kind of, as theorists, we can have all these ideas, we can critique all these things like identity and the individual liberal human and things, but they still impose themselves. They still kind of, we're not escaping them. So again, yeah, I'm not sure I'm trying to defeat the I. I'm not sure it's even possible, but I'm just trying to create situations where it can be kind of performed differently. Yeah, I think that's probably I'd like to end there and just ask everyone else to contribute or be part of that, rather than centering it all on me. That's okay.
That's fine, Gary. Thank you very much. So we already have 2 questions on the chat. I don't know, Olivia, if you would like to speak the questions yourself, or if you prefer me to read them, but you know.
Hi, yeah, I can speak. I thank you so much. It's been really interesting listening to all of this. I guess, yeah, I'm just to play devil's advocate, because I'm an artist and I love the idea of play, and I see the value in wasting time, go slow movement, all of this as like an idea of activism, obviously, and kind of, turning your back to the idea that we have to all create something that can be commodifiable and have, be part of this system. But if we're going to relate it back to what everything started with this idea that, things are at a place where theorists and academia can no longer, it will no longer be viable if it just stands aside and plays by itself. On the one hand, it needs to communicate with the things that are happening as things are crumbling around us. So I guess I'm just interested in, like how you could relate those two things.
Oh, I will do my best. Yeah, I did have an idea at some point. I haven't kind of pushed it, that maybe every time we publish some of the internet, and because obviously I'm probably responsible for a lot of things on the internet. Every time we publish something new on the internet, we should take something all down and kind of, so at least we're not kind of adding to it. I haven't pushed that idea. I'm not really sure why. I kind of, there's so many fights you can fight. At the same time, I'm very aware. I mean, the way particularly academia works, the institution works, is not participating. That's kind of very hard. It kind of speaks for you, or there's people that don't want to participate in the ref, or they don't want to publish and things. But after a while, you won't have a career. You won't, and that gap will be filled for you by, and which is increasingly happening anyway, will be more than likely filled by people who are doing less interesting work or less important work or something like that. So, when we had the opportunity to have a research centre at Coventry, the question was, well, is this the way it was organised? Did we want to do it? It came with certain conditions in certain circumstances that not everyone was happy about. And we could have kind of said, well, no, we're not really happy with that. But then, they would have either not had a research centre, which would deny a lot of colleagues the opportunity to do research, or they would have had a very different kind of research centre. So some of the ways that we've been kind of trying to negotiate that is trying to think, well, can we use this space to do the things, and to use it as an opportunity to do things that we think are important and we think are meaningful within that. But that's hard. How successful it is over the longer term, I don't know. It's difficult. It's compromised. So I'm not sure. It was kind of depends on which day you get me, whether that was the kind of right decision or not.
Sasha?
Yeah, I fully empathize with this kind of choices of what do you do once you're inside the university. I think when I mentioned also waste, I was talking about my colleague Megan's work. So I can't speak for her. I will post a little quote from her blog where she approaches waste and salvage from like an ecological thinking perspective. But I think there's something there about the infrastructure where my own answer to the question of waste would be, this is about what the university considers a productive use of my time versus what they would consider waste, but I would consider productive. And as Gary outlines, like the remuneration for that, right? Or the career cost that you pay for that, if you do pay or don't pay it, because also there are different ways to do it. And yeah, different circumstances and different institutions and different politics. But I think when we are organizing in the research group that I have, our own understanding of the existence of the research group was not to produce large size bids, because this is what the university wants us to do. And this is the conditions of funding for this research group. If you want to have funding, produce a research bid, right? And we always departed from the assumption that we are doing this to hold space for other things, because otherwise these things might not be possible for colleagues who are more junior than us, although it's difficult, or the postgraduate researchers or doctoral candidates, or precarious workers. So basically, I think there are ways to instrumentalize university infrastructure to different means. And I think this is what feminist STS also describes as politics of alterity, which I personally really like as a kind of ethical direction in terms of you are already in a position of being marginalized and the position of alterity. What can you do to use your status for a different goal that you're being pushed to? And I think this is, for me at least, was productive. And one other small thing that I wanted to mention that came up with this kind of more infrastructural thinking of what are your choices in academia. I think there's a lot to say about reproducing the canon through this kind of grant writing, through using references, particular way. And there's also a lot to say with this, again, like feminist tradition of citation, of constructing alternative canons. And actually, when Gary was talking about, when you were mentioning about the activism in literary circles, I was also thinking about how, for me, maybe how productive it was to see alternative literary canons in order to challenge my academic writing, because I learned from Lola Olufemi, who is a feminist thinker and writer, who also runs short courses for various kinds of people in experimental fiction. I don't know if she's going to run anymore, but I would highly recommend her writing in any case. And she introduced me to a whole alternative canon of resistant writing, predominantly from Black writers, like Vanessa Onugbuemezi, Amiri Baraka, June Jordan, Tony Kate Bambara, basically like the writers who also use the language in a very politicized way. And that actually did so much to liberate my thinking from the academic canon that I would highly recommend this to anyone, because it's an experientially new way of feeling in your body of how language can operate. And I think it should be really a part of what academics normally go for, but for some reason isn't. But we all know also for which reason. So yeah, thanks, Olivia, though. I think that's it's an important question. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
No, that was great. Thank you. I mean, I guess like thinking about it in terms of AI, it's so interesting when we're thinking about kind of echo chambers and algorithms. It's like it kind of relates back to that in an interesting way when we're thinking about institutions and publishing.
Okay, so Scott just pasted something very long in the chat. Maybe he wants to speak also, or not really.
Hey, thank you so much for your fascinating observations, masked media-wise. Gary, Hall, Sasha, Peter, and Benjamin. I asked this question regarding developing a free online set of 200 universities that are MIT OpenCourseWare centric, Creative Commons 4 licensed MIT OpenCourseWare centric in each of all 200 countries and in all 7,159 known living languages, and in seeking to create careers as well. And regarding possibly the PhD as a form of knowledge generation, each strong PhD in STEM and STEAM and humanities and arts sort of fields being a new form of knowledge generation. And how might masked media, with its focus on in creating theory anew in some ways, where each PhD could be said to create or address new forms of theory as addressing a novel research question, in new ways. And regarding developing World University and School further for free online PhD degrees from home, and even in a realistic virtual Earth. And I'll perhaps, so think Google Street View with Time Slider as a form of media informed by AI and machine learning. And I'm curious how your masked media might further constitute this radical new approach to creating even universities and PhD processes in AI and machine learning anew. A long question, but perhaps the text will help clarify it. Thank you again.
You want me to answer that? 200 free online world universities, school universities in 200 countries and languages. Okay, all right. Yeah, a while ago on this, we did a book about some of the things we were playing with at Coventry around media and things. That's a bit kind of, it was meant as an intervention in the open education space, which was quite topical at the particular time. And that was some of the things, but obviously that was before AI. Obviously, you know, I'm just going to say stuff off the top of my head. I mean, I haven't kind of, I'd need to have a look at that and engage with it specifically. But I guess it would be like, my immediate answer would be something like we were talking about the approach of the city, which would be not providing some sort of top-down plan or master vision for, you know, all these 200 free online universities and school universities and all this kind of thing. It would be more using all the organizations and the institutions and the infrastructure that we're all providing via, you know, open source you've already mentioned, and open access and free software, and even the kind of the pirate and shadow libraries, and kind of making that available to people and giving them opportunities to build their own institutions. And when we talk about it in the city and in the book, it's not just universities, it's art galleries or museums or archives or whatever. But the idea is not for someone like me to come up with a response to that. It's like, well, I have a plan and I have a vision. It would be more what we've been trying to do with our projects already. And part of the result of working on the city was to say, well, look, this is not just about theory. This is not just about the university. You can use this in different spheres of society. Would be to say, well, look, you know, maybe we've got to let people form their own communities, build their own universities, have that kind of say, rather than, and Peter was talking about it in terms of the challenge of his research, of not just speaking to other people and just using them as subjects in their kind of research, and then you get academic credit for it. It's to kind of work with people and to know with them, and so make available all these resources. And yeah, they can use them if they want, they can adapt them if they want, they can reject them if they want. But that would be my kind of quick answer, I'm guessing.
Super, thank you. The wiki aspect, like Wikipedia in 342 languages, of us all being able to work together, wiki teaching, wiki learning, potentially being fast in the distributed internet, which is not centralized in some ways, which is not focused. Does that offer a way forward, potentially? People teaching with wiki?
Yeah, wikis are something we used at point. Sorry, this is going to burn smoke. I think it was about 10 years ago with like a book series called Liquid Books and another one called Living Books About Life. And we kind of used the wikis there to kind of show that you could make different kinds of books, and they would always be open, they would always be fluid. They wouldn't be just produced by their authors, they would be produced by a community, and they can all get involved and can completely update them. And yeah, you could use them for course readers, for example. I mean, I remember, you know, everyone used to kind of, the start of term, everyone used to crowd around the photocopier, so you'd be kind of endlessly producing these massive packs of photocopies. Well, you wouldn't need to do that anymore. You could get all this stuff and have it on have it in the wiki, and then, individual course tutors could make that bespoke to them. Individual students or groups of students could make versions that were bespoke to them. That was the kind of idea that we had at the time, and it's been used a little bit. Some people have kind of borrowed it and take it and ran with it. It's kind of interesting, yeah.
Okay, I would like to.
Thank you.
I would like to bring the conversation back to the context of the ACLA seminar and the Laboratory of Contemporary Writing. I mean, I like Benjamin's idea of theory as an exercise of failure. Like, I don't think it has any fatalistic or catastrophic sense, an exercise of failure that is therefore always already a performance. And to the idea that, like, if we think of theory in that way, your argument, Gary, in this book, is that doing things differently cannot be just an aesthetic experiment with academic writing. It's more, maybe you don't use these terms in the same way, but it's more like subjective work in a psychoanalytic sense. And I would like to think about Sasha's idea of wasting time. Maybe she can, if she wants, add something in connection with this subjective work. Wasting time is like maybe making time for gift labor. It's a topic in your book. And I think I have two questions regarding all of these. One maybe also connecting to Peter's presentation. I think you read Peter Gary's book as a kind of trans-autography. So it would be interesting to listen to, like closeness and distance between infrapolitics, autography, trans-autography, and the kind of bet that not just this book, but like the whole of Gary's career around creating institutions and not just experimenting with a biographical register. I mean, I think this is something I'm very interested in, and I think it has to do with this idea of theory as an exercise of failure. Anyway. I don't know if my question makes any sense. I hope it does. Benjamin wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your clarification, Gabriela. I felt the need to make some of that up as well. I think, I mean, to contrast what you perceived, Gary, as a sort of a gloomy thing. Of course, I welcome your hug. You're very much correspondent. But I mean, on the contrary, I think it's essentially a matter of celebrating like what has been a massive amount of infrastructure construction that you are presenting in a very clear and ordered way with its accompanying theoretical elaboration and so on. And I want to say two things in response to your point, Scott. I think what's missing in that equation is precisely the question of bonds. In other words, okay, so we have all this amazing arsenal, but how are those relations actually patterned, and what do they give forth to use the old-fashioned word, humanly? I'm just saying this to try to be clear. But I think it's a real question because I mean, bottom line, the issue is how do we relate in the midst of all of this mechanization and so on. So I think that's an outstanding point, which would lead to a long conversation, I'm sure. And coming back to the construction of this really quite phenomenal accumulation of infrastructures, since performance is the name of the game and not simply theory, whatever that might be these days, I think it really is a matter also of stepping aside from the impotence that university can make us feel and take some decisions about some of the matters we might want to take up on the basis of this infrastructure. So we have a massive amount of resources that we could basically orient to whatever ends we think are important and worth it. And I think that I just want to sort of counterpoint to that feeling of not being able to fully respond. I mean, we're in a pretty sticky patch world-wise, that is clear, but our ability to respond is really, I think, sort of mature, whatever that might mean, on account of a long sequence of events over the last decade. So maybe we should think of doing things specifically with all of that.
Peter.
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts. I'm going to try and make some of this make sense. I'm probably not going to be able to say everything I'd like to say. I think your clarification, Gabriela, was really useful for me, because I think part of what I was trying to work out in the response that I gave to your book, Gary, was thinking about this register of authorship along a kind of psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, where the ITS becomes an interruption of the thought process coming from this slip, and thinking about authorship even within what we conventionally think of as a self and author as being this diffracted to come, and the dependence that we have on all kinds of communities, human and inhuman, to sort of bring that about, right? And then the masking sort of happens afterwards, where we retrospectively say that this is the work of the authorial I. And I think that's been really important for me personally, thinking about in this transautographic experiment that Gabriela was referring to, that I've done with Madalena Gerardo in particular, I think is here. And so, yeah, I think that's the first dimension that I'd like to bring out from that, without saying much more than that. I think there's a way in which I'm thinking about what one of the challenges that your book presented with me, Gary, was thinking about an aspect I hadn't really thought about in the work that Madalena and I are doing together, or we've not thematized really in a very explicit way, which is about the actual material infrastructures in which we're operating, and how this kind of mode of trying an experimental writing praxis, which tries to resist and mobilize that aspect of otherness even within the self as author, there's often hidden, masked, how that can communicate with and be in contact with these other forms of material experimentation, and what does that mean for the kinds of different forms of subjectivity and interpolation that might imply. I've not got really answers to that, but it's really, I mean, I think it's really got me thinking about this much more in a much more explicit sort of way. And so I think in terms of the second part, I would say is sort of in answer to the question that you presented, Gabriela, of how to think about these different aspects in mass media in terms of the transautographic writing. I think that what really resonates for me is in terms of a lot of what Sasha has presented specifically, of the ways in which, when we're talking about the self-authorial I, And, we've talked about various different ways in which the I and the author is kind of inescapable and necessary, and there are different aspects to this. But I think we're really also speaking about a specific grounding in institutional practices, which we, despite ourselves, often feel ourselves falling into, even in the moments that we're trying to resist them. And I think one of the things that's at stake for me in thinking about all of this are the ways in which these practices, these writing practices and publishing practices, which are also about new subjectivities and interpolation, part of it is an educational experience, right, of being able to imagine otherwises, alternative ways of doing things, and understanding that actually, because once you're in it, and I've kind of gone through this process myself, once you're in these institutional imperatives, often it's difficult to imagine the ways in which actually the privilege of that extra time that we get in terms of research, even if often that happens, in the twilight hours, etc., can be reimagined and can be rethought and then retrospectively justified in other ways. And I think that this is this needs to be part of the kinds of practices of collaboration that we do together. I think I was a bit all over the place, but I hope some of that made sense.
Hey, Sasha, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Peter because I think the imaginaries part is like what my personal work has fallen into the most, and the work that I'm doing on imaginaries of technology has come from the same realization. There was a paragraph in Mark Fisher that stuck with me for, at this point, like more than 10 years, where he describes that the fall of Soviet Union has liberated the West from like the perceived perils of belief, which I thought was really kind of good structural point made, because the space of imagination or space of imaginary, especially socio-technical ones, is indeed extremely hard to embody, because once you are in it, it's more the matter of affect and feeling and living in it, right? But again, if you are overworked at the university, it's very hard to imagine literally anything, as opposed to just going home and sleeping, for me at least, on my most days. So I think this feeling or this understanding that imaginary is as important as the actual work has led me into the space of this feminist STS and science fiction and like imagining otherwise, which is between radicalizing work, between the people, the kind of the traditional kind of Marxists ideology and like awareness raising, right? And between affect, joy, pleasure, imagination, kind of literary canons, right, that we experience. So I just wanted to respond directly to that, because I think we're all feeling that.
Yeah, thank you.
So before anyone else raises their hand, I think there was a second part of the first question that maybe we haven't explicitly addressed, and it was made during your intervention, Sasha, but it also relates to Gary's book, of course, and it has to do with risk. So, I mean, I have one way of posing the question. I think one of the first volumes of Culture Machine was called Taking Risks with the Future. And, like 25 years later, someone asks a question about risk. And I would like to ask you, Gary, like if the sense of risk has changed for you in these years. I mean, for me, it has, because it's no longer just a question of, using the institutional resources that we have to do unexpected things or something else than what the university expects from us. It's no longer just that. It's in my perception, what the risks that we need to take now are a bit harder. And, I can just think about the description of university as infrastructure, the open call for papers. I think you had just extended the deadline for abstracts, Sasha. But basically, that call for papers updates, I think, one of the initial calls of Culture Machine, So yeah, I mean, this is just a question, like, to try to think what other senses of risk we might be facing now or having to think now. My own hypothesis has to do with existential risk beyond just economic risk. So, I mean, it's just a question. And if anyone has another question, they can, I mean, we only have 10 minutes left, so this would be your last chance.
You want me to respond about risk? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to kind of remember what we were thinking at the moment. I'm guessing it was something around imagining otherwise, as Peter so helpfully put it. And I think that is even more important now than perhaps it was then, although I agree with you that it is even harder. So I'll give you the example of my own kind of context and whatever. One of the ways we thought about or told ourselves a story about the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures, or maybe it was just a story that I told, was, if we'd have been in a liberal university, then they would have read our stuff, they really wouldn't have liked it, and they would have kicked us out, or they wouldn't have let us in the first place. In a neoliberal university, they don't read your stuff. All they do is, have you got the metrics? We can audit it. Are you publishing in the right place? Are you getting the right amount of impact and all those kind of indicators? And this kind of relates to the point about the wasting time and non-productive time, is because our strategy a lot of the time was, well, as long as we hit those markers, we can do what the hell we like with the rest of the time. We can do the things that we think are really important and meaningful. Because, as long as we hit those indicators, that's the things that the neoliberal university is looking at, and that's okay. It's becoming even harder to kind of do that, to take that kind of, if you like, that kind of risk, partly because of some of the things that Sasha was talking about in terms of grants. So, for us, a lot of the time, we don't need funding to do what we want to do. Most of us just want to sit at the desk and have a think, read some stuff. You don't need big grants for this. You just need a bit of time. Now, obviously, for neoliberals, that looks like you're wasting time. That looks like you're doing nothing productive, and they've got to fill that up. So one of the ways they fill that up is by insisting everyone brings in lots of money and you apply for funding, even though the chances of you getting funding are smaller and smaller because there's less to go around. But it's kind of, you're still looking busy, you're still doing something. And obviously, the things that you can apply for, you don't get a say over that. That's set by governments in terms of policy. It's usually presented in the UK in the form of, challenges, social challenges that Europe comes up with, or the UK government comes up with. So, it gets narrower and narrower. So that kind of freedom, that space where you can take risks, becomes harder and harder. I guess at the moment I'm kind of thinking, okay, so we might need to rethink this a little bit. Where can we regroup a little bit, so that in terms of what Benjamin was talking about, a stepping aside from impotence, we don't just think, look, this is being done to us and we've got less chance of doing something, which is, yes, often how institution makes us feel. How can we reclaim some of that space, to kind of that space of, so that is the question that we want to be asking. So it's great that you're doing an issue on it. It's like, what are the risks we need to take now, and how can we do it in this particular context, which is very different, and in some senses does feel even more tightly controlled. There's even less spaces, opportunities for people to do it. And I appreciate that people at a different career stage, an earlier career stage especially, feels it's all been kind of tightened and closed in. And the only space you can do this is some kind of liminal space or kind of marginal space where you've already got to have access to some sort of money or funding and things to be able to survive and do this. And if you haven't, then it just becomes really, really hard. So that would be my immediate response.
Okay. Anyone else has a question or something to share? I mean, otherwise, I want to thank you, Gary, for, writing this book, which I enjoyed very much reading. And I also think it is an indispensable point of departure for the works of our newly constituted laboratory. In many different senses, of course, it has lots of it is this catalog of things that have already been done, but also in, like more conceptual sense of what writing differently is about. Again, not just an aesthetic experiment that leaves, like individual authorship untouched, but more, as Benjamin would have it, sort of generator or cultivator of social bonds, different social bonds. So I think we would like this laboratory to remain a space of encounter between many, many different singularities and, like perspectives, contexts, and institutional initiatives also. So, I mean, you know that I love you. So I am very grateful that you are here with us. It is a very special thing for me. And I would like to thank Sasha for also taking time to be here with us. It is very important to me, this issue that you are co-editing, University as Infrastructure. And I also want you to be part of the Laboratory of Contemporary Writing. And thank you, Peter and Benjamin, all the people that are here. That's, I know them from here or from there, but for me, it is, a community of those who have nothing in common, the only kind of community that makes sense to me. So thank you very much. And I would leave it there too. I don't know if Peter wants to say something.
Just also thank you, Gabriela. I think, we don't underestimate what it means to arrest time from the university to put together something like this. And this has been such a thought-provoking and interesting event. So thank you for putting it all on. And thanks to Gary again, of course, for providing us the opportunity.
Well, thanks to everyone. It just make me feel more like I've got community now. I feel reassured. I'm dealing with my mental weak points much better now after this. It's been really important. I appreciate it from everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gary. Thank you,
Thanks,
Gabriela.
Gary, also.
Talk to you all soon.
Take care.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.